Miranda Bogen is the director of the AI Governance Lab at the Center for Democracy and Technology and the co-author of the recent and very timely report, Risky Business, Advanced AI Companies Race for Revenue. Miranda, welcome to Untangled.
Thanks so much.
So I said that it's real timely because OpenAI just announced that it would start testing ads in the free tier. Help depict for listeners how their experience of ChatGPT is about to change.
I think at first it's not going to change too much. As you said, this is only initial experiments in the free tier, but I would expect that to change quite quickly because the name of the game with advertising is knowing about a person's intent, an intent to take an action or purchase something or pursue some kind of good or service. And, you know, Google search is one place where that intent is pretty high, but chatbots are an extended interaction where you're really getting into the details of some task you're trying to accomplish or, comparing and contrasting different options. They're going to be extremely rich signals of how likely you are to do something that advertisers are going to really want. So now that OpenAI has broken the seal, it's probably going to be pretty hard for them to hold off introducing this in a whole lot of other ways, and not necessarily just on the free tier. OpenAI's new CEO of product, Fiji Simo, was previously at Instacart. Instacart has membership tiers, and even there were advertisements all over the place. Advertisements for products, advertisements for restaurants, last minute, don't forget before you check out advertisements, video advertisements. And so I wouldn't expect these to continue being a clean separation between different business models.
In the report, you effectively argue that the privacy risks aren't accidental, they're structural. The incentives are for these companies to collect ever more personal data. That was true of social media, it's true of generative AI. At the same point, to the point you just made about our intent being different when we use these systems, the data that feed generative AI are quite different from the data that we post on social media or put into a search query. It's often more intimate and personal. Like, how do you expect the ad experience and associated privacy harms similar, different to what we've experienced with search and social media?
On one hand, the ads that interrupt people's experience on social media are interesting because they're doing just that. They're interrupting. They're not what you're trying to see. And the platforms are trying to predict what's likely to be most interesting and least disruptive, which could actually require collecting a whole lot more data because they really don't know what it is you want at any given time. Whereas if you're putting in something specific, a specific query, or you're deliberating about a specific thing, you actually have much more information right then and there. At the same time, as more and more advertisers are competing to get their products or services surfaced to users, the platforms will need more and more granular information around what would nudge one ad to take the place of another, what's most likely to be useful in that moment. So there will still be an incentive to collect more data. One of the main points of the report was that it isn't just ads that create incentives and not just ads that create incentives for collecting more data. So for instance, even subscription models for services that are attempting to act on your behalf, take actions that have financial consequences or interact in the world in a way that could represent you, the cost of errors, if that tool messes up, that is going to reflect very poorly on that product. So that also creates an incentive to get everything right, to really be able to interpret your intent into action, even if there's no, monetary incentive behind the scenes that's shaping that behavior beyond wanting to do its best for you. So just because ads are introduced doesn't mean that there was not previously an incentive to collect that data. It just means that the incentives might no longer be aligned or as aligned with users as they would otherwise be. And even with agent products that are supposed to be helpful to you, work on your behalf, there's no requirement that they're doing that with fidelity at the moment. We don't have like a duty of care or a fiduciary duty at the moment, but you could see how one business model might be more conducive to allowing for that than an advertising business model where there are multiple parties involved and the ones paying the bills are someone other than you.
Right. It breaks that relationship. I mean, I wanted to walk through the press release with you because there was some language that was sort of hard to parse, and I wanted to make sense of it together. So at one point, OpenAI states that, quote, the ads will not change ChatGPT answers. And when I read that, the first thought I had was, okay, well, how would we know if this is true or not? Like, we can't audit the training data. We can't see what fine tuning was or wasn't applied. How did you make sense of that statement? And also, like, what would have to change for that statement to be verifiable?
My guess is what they meant by that is that the way the model processes a user's input is not being modified by options that advertisers are providing for what to show. That's very different from nothing about your experience will change or the way that the outputs of a system tend to be produced will change over time. And that they could end up changing in a few ways, even if the company doesn't intend for them to or isn't envisioning what this means. So first is if you see an ad and then you act on it and you ask a follow-up question, that will change the behavior of the model because these tools are looking at the context of a conversation and they're also collecting memory over time. So the whole environment is changing means that the model will change and you'd have to keep things really separate for that not to even indirectly happen. But that's sort of just an externality of introducing, new information into the space, even if it's a sort of separate unit. But what I anticipate happening is that standalone separate ads, banner ads or kind of demarcated ads won't be the end of experimentation with the format of ads. The interactive modality of AI systems is just too rich and interactive to stop there. And you could imagine a type of ad, like think about lead generation ads. So lead generation is when you have really high intent people who are opting in to send their information to third parties because they're looking for some kind of service and they want to see options. That might not require changing the output of a model to say, I'm looking for a lawyer to help me with such and or other. The model might say, well, in general, lawyers, this and that. Would you like me to contact some of them? Nothing about that, indicates that it's preferencing any particular service providers, but it might then get, the company might get compensated by sending your information to a specific set of those providers, and you might not know. And so there's a lot of ways that this could end up getting shaped that, like, a specific thumb on the scale of what the model produces. So you asked, how would we know if this is happening? It's a great question. Model training pipelines are so complicated. There's so many different steps. We don't have any ways to verify any of those things really well at the moment. So it's going to be quite difficult to know if anything's changed and how the financial incentives are going about it. But, I think we'll start to see advertiser documentation. We'll start to see models themselves. We'll start to see security researchers looking at where is information going. And I think it'll be pretty difficult. Even on social media platforms, we're still seeing examples of where advertisers are contesting some of the charges because they're fraudulent, bots and clicks and things that they're getting charged for. And there's not currently a verification regime that's super reliable there either. So this is going to be really murky for quite some time.
Such a good point. I mean, another thing that OpenAI included in the press release is that, quote, your chats with ChatGPT are not shared with advertisers. But BetterHelp, for example, doesn't need to know that I was going through a really hard time last week in order to target me in the moment, right? OpenAI will do that for them, no?
Yeah, it's a huge sleight of hand that we've seen across all advertisers. You don't have to send a list of specific individuals to advertisers for them to reach you. That's the whole point. The platform is able to deliver ads on behalf of advertisers and shield their specific identities while still making those connections. So it's true to a word, but not true in spirit. Even then, advertisers can still discover later on the individuals who they reached by who ends up acting on those ads. So if people are most concerned about humans seeing their conversations with chatbots, this probably won't change the risks related to that. That's a sensitivity that these companies are well aware of, and they're fighting tooth and nail for chat logs to not get turned over as evidence in court, even when that might be actually necessary for research. But they get that users are sensitive to that. It's a totally different threat model for privacy when it's more about how are people using the data you're providing, even if they can't see it directly with their own eyes.
Right. Speaking of how our data is sort of controlled or not, the press release also says that you can control how your data is used, and that, quote, you can turn off personalization and you can clear the data used for ads at any time. Now, interestingly, the press release didn't explicitly mention how sort of your chat memory will or won't be used to target ads. Does turning off personalization and sort of clearing the data used for ads meaningfully limit targeted ads? Or should we assume that every conversation we've ever had with ChatGPT will now be given to a company to sell us something?
Well, there are a lot of ways that interactive chatbots are being personalized these days. So it's actually quite hard to parse what is happening at any given time. So there's your raw chat logs and just, pulling on those, being able to reference back to those is one way. The next way is sort of a more enhanced version of memory, which is learning explicitly little factoids or characteristics and storing those in a human readable interface in some way so that you can see what was remembered about you. But just because you delete things in that interface doesn't mean that the raw conversation where that thing was learned was deleted. And neither does it mean that there isn't some more abstract learning going on that is basically using machine learning to look for patterns. And that's separate from specific memories that are stored about you. And it's not clear how user controls flow across those different surfaces. So that's separately from ads, like I think a whole level, a whole ball of wax that an average user is really going to struggle to understand what they're controlling and, how that will change their experience. Even if you turned off all personalization and all memory in a system, the amount of context a chatbot has or how long it can remember your conversation is still pretty lengthy, and a lot of detail can end up in that conversation that becomes pertinent to an ad. And so it still doesn't get away from there's going to be something personalized to your interaction with the system. The question is, how long is that visibility over time? And can they control it in the way they think they can?
Well, so changing tact a little bit, one of the issues is that, we anthropomorphize chatbots. These companies do the same. They give them names, they give them genders, and they're often sort of framed as your friend. In the report, you write a bit about the implications of this blurring line between friends and advertisers, which seems really bad. Talk a bit about those implications.
Yeah, I mean, on these other platforms where ads are the norm, it's pretty clear that the platform is a company. It's not an entity. You're not interacting with it. Ads are, units that are demarcated clearly, but only after they were, scolded into doing that by the FTC and civil society. But when you're interacting with something that feels human-like, us, it seemed like we were going to move into the direction more of like influencer marketing, where maybe there's an indication that there was a paid preference, or even that, there was some exchange of money that wasn't leading to you seeing that ad, but that there was value that the company was getting for paying attention to a given topic. But it's kind of surrounded by this veneer of social experience and of social validation. And especially as people are leaning on these tools for emotional support, for professional support, they have continued signals of trust building, potentially. Like if it's working, if it appears to be working, if it's responding in a way that is useful, it's likely that trust will grow over time. And so it's no longer just like a standalone advertisement. That's something that your friend is telling you, that your coworker is telling you. And that's so valuable. Companies kill for organic reach, for validation from real people. And so this is not quite that, but it certainly could have the experience of that, which I think will make us need to rethink what are our expectations for disclosure and what is that duty of care. Like, when do these platforms need to account for your well-being in what they're serving to you, which is a different relationship than these other platforms had, where they could do more to care, but like at the same time they're just content delivery services, whereas these tools are built to be your assistant, your friend, your coworker.
Yeah. I mean, so we've been so far digging in on OpenAI a bit, but I'm hoping you can situate OpenAI in a sort of broader business model landscape. These chatbots are basically commodities. There are some differences around the edges, but I have a hard time imagining that a handful of years from now, we'll still be using 4, 5, 6 of these different models, especially if all of the companies sort of adopt similar business models. That might be wrong. We'll see. But I mean, could you imagine Anthropic or another competitor to OpenAI trying to differentiate themselves by pursuing an alternative model, or are ads just too compelling?
We are seeing some differentiation of strategies here. In the report, we looked at subscriptions, APIs, ads, and subsidized recommendations, commerce and sort of marketplace dynamics, government contracts, devices, and subsidizing other business models. So with the traditional players, we're seeing a lot of their existing ad businesses and their existing customer businesses are subsidizing their AI work. So they're not under quite as much pressure, although at the same time, they already have the infrastructure for ads. I think Demis Hassabis just said in the last week, a little side eye, that they probably, they don't think they would add ads to Gemini. But at the same time, there are ads in Google Search Overview, Google AI Search. And so the user experience isn't necessarily differentiated. Anthropic has really leaned into the B2B strategy. And so their primary source of revenue right now is businesses through API or through business accounts. And that it certainly can help with predictable revenue, and it can also change incentives. If the downstream deployers of AI or the users of AI need to maintain trust with their own customers or their own users, they're going to care a lot around the trustworthiness of the tool that they're using. And hopefully they can put some of that pressure back on the company to build in tools and techniques that enable them to do that. End users typically can't see those patterns as clearly, so it's a lot harder for people to kind of organize and demand better of companies. So it seems like Anthropic is much less likely to adopt ads, although, again, like everyone's under so much pressure to bring returns for these huge investments they've made. But they have acknowledged that they're a business, and in order to do the research they want to do, they need to support the infrastructure needs through their business. And so I don't think they've discounted it, but they definitely are not right on the heels of OpenAI. But I do think there's enough other players in the ecosystem that are already deep in the weeds of ads that will see it a lot more in chatbot experiences. People will start to become, accustomed to it, and it will just take off from there, unfortunately. The real question is, will it destroy people's trust before it kind of takes hold? Because if it does, then it's going to kind of crumble and they'll go back to other business models. But if they do it kind of slowly and people find some value in it and the harms don't immediately manifest, then I think it'll be clear that that'll just sort of pick up steam over time, as we saw with other platforms. But I think there will be a fork in the road moment of how people respond once these experiments start running.
Well, that leads into my next question, because it's like if they're successful in picking up steam, are we then just on a course towards Cory Doctorow's phrase of enshittification? Should we anticipate a world wherein we're having an increasingly worse experience over time on generative AI? Or is there any reason to expect that generative AI will somehow follow a different path than search and social media and so forth?
I think we'll see a divergence in experiences. I think it will enshittify some people's experience, but that's actually not unique to ads. So again, generative AI, unlike other tech platforms, have high unit costs. Like, it's not just upfront investment and then basically free to serve. It costs money every time to run these queries. And so these companies are looking for every way they can to lower that cost wherever they can. And so we're seeing experimentation with using less advanced models for simpler queries, for using smaller models for devices that can't handle larger models. And it's all in the name of providing access to AI to people who might not otherwise access it. But at the same time, it's not clear what degradation of value people will get if they're, accessing AI using less powerful models or models that are where the experience is interrupted by ads. I think we'll see a lot of that experimentation, but I think there will also always be a tier of people who are willing to pay and will get a higher level of service, and there will be a desire to protect that because people, if it works well, will be willing to pay quite a lot. I think we'll just see a big schism there. And that is what some folks have worried about in terms of AI as a accelerator of inequality at a macro level. But at the same time, it could also accelerate inequality at a micro level. And if you're using it and it provides you bad information or harmful information or it discriminates against you, all those things matter too, and matter probably now and not so, and even before the longer term.
Speaking of harms, What are your biggest concerns right now? Now that we know that OpenAI is going to pursue ads, but also more broadly in the context of these business models, we know from social media and search that so many of the downstream effects stem from the business model itself. If you're a state regulator, if you're a policymaker, what are the new threats?
I actually don't think that they're necessarily new threats. I think they're old threats that are emerging in a place where people haven't had to deal with them yet. So, a lot of the folks who've been thinking about AI and its harms have been focused more on systemic harms or catastrophic harms and bioterror and cybersecurity and geopolitics. And, it's important to think about those things. It was only more recently that these research labs became product companies, needed to confront the types of harms that some of the more traditional platforms have been chewing on for a number of years and have sort of been burned by. And so I think we'll see a lot of unnecessary errors because these companies haven't staffed up with the people who know what a privacy harm looks like. So we're talking about, discrimination, right? A lot of discrimination in advertising on Google, Facebook, et cetera, was, you could argue, somewhat incidental, right? People weren't intending to use these products necessarily for looking for jobs or, applying for credit cards, because it was all content that happened to happen. AI tools are being billed as assistants in your personal life and in work. I think it was in OpenAI's business strategy that one of the big use cases might be finding a home, finding a job. Like, they're being pitched as these things that actually have those economic impacts more directly. And so anything that's personalizing based on your interactions over a long period of time are going to lead to those same divisions and outcomes that we saw in personalized ad delivery elsewhere. I think we've, over the years, conversations about privacy harms have moved from like data disclosure and incidental sharing to how do people use the data? What is that data doing to kind of change your life, change what opportunities are available to you, exploit your vulnerability in some way? And I think we can all imagine so many ways that these systems can end up exploiting that vulnerability, even if it wasn't intended, in the name of being helpful, because helpful can mean relying on shortcuts or stereotypes or, offering something that maybe seems useful in the short term, but folks who actually know that context know that in the long term, that tends not to be helpful. And you really need to talk to people and understand those harms and build awareness of those harms into these systems to prevent them. The problem is that what general purpose technology is doing is pushing that expertise outward and downward. They're not involved as much in the development, and so we're not able to spot those risks as clearly. And so we're going to need to catch up later on and go back and fix it. And I think that's one of the big risks here is just that very obvious things will be overlooked because there's an assumption that if it's general purpose and capable enough, it will circumvent the problems of the past. And I just don't think that that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like we have failed in a big way to learn the lesson of algorithmic decision-making systems, of social media. We don't identify those harms in advance. We just let the tool out into the wild, see what happens, and it turns out that it often reinforces different societal biases.
And I think one of the complexities now is not only will that be the case on discrete products and tools, these tools are being built to connect with one another. There's going to be an ecosystem of AI agents that are calling tools that are connecting with your banks and other service providers and exchanging information. And it's going to be very hard to track what happens where in that pipeline. Like, this was the case for ads and sort of ad networks, ad bidding and things like that. There are a lot of players behind the scenes that folks don't know about, but that was all in the service of delivering ads on like a small set of platforms. Now we're going to have a much more complex ecosystem. And so even just tracking where any of this is happening, where exchanges of money and incentives are happening behind the scenes, and where that might be shaping people's experiences in a negative way will just be even more challenging to keep up with over time.
Cool. So same problem, but harder to identify.
Exactly. We're in good shape.
Great, great, great. Okay. I mean, one of the reasons we keep coming back to ads as the business model of the internet is because these companies continue to pursue a kind of scale at all cost approach. Like, Facebook wanted to connect and monetize the world in pursuing artificial general intelligence, whatever that means. OpenAI started down the path of needing ever more compute and ever more data. And it seems like despite Sam Altman saying that ads were a last resort, that we were always going to end up here. Like, could you imagine a viable alternative in a financial system that rewards scale and, should these companies go public anyway, demands maximizing shareholder value on a quarterly basis?
Business models rely on demonstrating value to someone. And so I think there are a lot of ways in which AI tools are demonstrating very concrete value to people who are willing to pay for it. The question is, are there enough people who are willing to pay enough for it? And the
Yeah,
answer right now is no, not yet. And so that's, there's sort of like a real statement that also is, some people treat as a joke, but others haven't treated as a joke, which is that when the AI gets advanced enough, it will come up with a business model that will solve for this. But we haven't gotten there.
sure.
And it seems like the ones they're coming up with are rehashing, well-trodden ground. I've seen in my years of experience working adjacent to ads, which somehow I keep doing, that it's really easy to back yourself into an argument for them, that they're providing value, that they're, connecting people with services and offers and goods that they wouldn't otherwise know about. And the more personalized that you get, the less annoying it is because you're not being bombarded with things that you don't want. And that, in some cases, that actually can connect people with things that are useful. I mean, there are a lot of public service organizations that, use the heck out of Facebook to reach populations that were otherwise quite difficult to reach with information about social services and jobs programs and university educational opportunities and things like that. Reaching people is something that many people need. And so I don't see it going away. The question is whether we can get the positive value out of it without the externalities of it. And I think one of the challenges with the digital version of ads is that not only are they trying to reach people at scale, the ad platforms themselves need to scale, which removes editorial discretion. It removes visibility into what's being advertised. And I think one of the big harms that have come out of ads are that people were misusing them. There were things that were low quality that were being delivered to people. And then there were ways in which how ads were being shared with different populations, even if they weren't malicious, ended up being unfair. But there weren't enough people to spot that was happening, and so you had to build a whole lot of tools to spot low quality ads or ads that violate policy or things like that, because it's also a scaled enterprise. So I think any world where advertising ends up there will probably suffer from similar challenges. They'll probably try to use AI to police that, and we've all seen how that goes. Maybe it'll be a little bit better than machine learning classifiers that make a lot of errors themselves, but there will still be things that get through the cracks, and it's those ones that go unnoticed that still manage to reach a lot of people, where a lot of harm can come about. And then there's just the sort of population level externalities of highly personalized ads and where that can go. So I think people will argue themselves into ads before they argue themselves out of them.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, imagine it's 2029 and the bubble hasn't popped. These companies sort of figured it out. OpenAI is a massive company. The rest of the industry is sort of like leaned into an advertising model, though perhaps there's some differentiation. You're advising the next administration on one big thing they could do to sort of shift power back to people, back to the consumer. What would you do?
So I think what that business model ecosystem will look like, will probably involve ads, but given that a lot of these tools are being pitched as assistants and agents and things like that, my guess is there'll be a lot more about like transaction fees and things like that, where it's, someone's taking on the cost of making that transaction. That's what happens in the financial sector with credit card transactions. So I think we'll see a lot more of that. And I don't know yet how that will kind of implicate people's experience, but in any case, there's some financial incentive behind the scenes that people don't know about. So I think we're going to need to explore some version of duty of care, especially in certain contexts. Like if you're asking for a doctor, it really, these systems really need to not be incentivized to send you to some insurance mill that is just trying to, eke out dollars and not actually provide you care. And so, like, who's responsible for that? You'd have to go sector by sector to deal with it outside of advertising. But if there's like an intermediary, there's probably something there. Although, it's really hard to guarantee when everything's just a prediction. And certainly, I think industry is going to be hesitant to throw their weight behind that, even though they've sort of floated the idea that, legal conversations or medical conversations should be confidential and privileged somehow. I think they, might stop short at saying, we'll take on the responsibility for the recommendations we're making here. So that's where policy comes into play to kind of shift the incentives. I think there's a lot of other implications of that might end up locking down tools and they aren't as helpful anymore because they can't be as free flowing. And that might be the case. But if the alternative is that there's a whole lot of junk getting kind of sent around and people are being, brought in circles for money, like that might be the trade-off that's needed. But I think we'll have to see. And it's also possible that the, research has lowered the cost of serving models that are pretty effective enough that people are willing to pay what's needed to run those models, and really where more money's needed is to keep kind of pushing further and further. But unclear when we'll see diminishing returns of more and more advanced models on just like the day-to-day stuff that people actually need. I think businesses are already finding a lot of value in the tools that exist, even if they're still, experimenting and not all of the pilots are going well. Like it might be that that's enough.
The last question I always end on is, what advice or wisdom would you offer your teenage self?
I didn't ever think a wink about ads or incentives when I was in high school, like who's paying who for what and how does that change my life? I think teens are probably more aware of that now that they've kind of come up through social media and they see both, obvious ads and more organic influence approaches kind of just in their day-to-day life. But I would I would tell myself to like just stop and like squint a little bit. I took a college class with a former Secretary of State, and he taught us to read the news. And he basically taught us to read between the lines of what a news article says. Like, who are they? Like, why are they quoting who they're quoting? What was the last line of the article? Because that tells you what the reporter thinks. And I think there's a lot of similar things here too. That even when you're still a college student or a teen, you can start doing of like, why did they do that? Like, what does it mean for them to be doing that? What happened when another company I work with did that? And like, what does it mean for me to kind of delete the memory on my app? And like, can I actually do that? Did it change my experience? So I think it's very tangible now. I think people are going to see it and play with it and tinker it and start to really hopefully understand more quickly what the implications of these choices are than we did, 10, 15 years ago when all of this was new and everyone was just so excited about the potential of technology that we kind of pushed off the conversations about the costs. I think we're more attuned to that now. So I just hope people will lean into that and have those conversations and hopefully, be loud when they don't like where something is going. Because while it's harder for users to organize than business customers to push back on vendors, when we do, I think we can have an impact because these are the people who are going to be funding these companies to come. And if they say we're not going to do that anymore, then they'll feel pressure. And I think one other piece here that will really determine how this will play out is how easy will it be to switch from one product to the other? Like right now, they're somewhat fungible. The question is whether you can pull all of your history and context from one tool that you've been working with for a year or 2 years. It really gets you to another one if a company makes a decision you don't like. And right now there's like some movement to that effect, but it's super vague. It's super nascent. So I think from a regulatory perspective, that's another thing that might make a difference here is, can companies actually compete on meeting the needs of their users or the broader public?
I mean, the charge I'm taking from that is to read between the lines and be loud when things go sideways. The report is risky business. Advanced AI companies race for revenue. Anyone who cares about how generative AI will affect people, will affect you, your life, should give it a read because, as Miranda's made clear here, the effects are often downstream from the business model. Miranda Bogen, thanks so much for coming on Untangled.
Thanks for having me, Charlie.